Okay, we're back with question 3. Can you talk a little bit about the limitations of digitized materials? What should our students know, and faculty as well, about using digital collections, how those collections relate to physical collections, to their physical counterparts? What are the sort of promises and perils of digitized materials?
Yeah, so I am really glad that we're talking about this, because I think in our kind of new reality, this is the most important thing that I want people to kind of get into the mindset of realizing. So first of all, the amount of collection material in archives in the world that is available online that you can just, search for, find the full, digitized surrogate item, it's minuscule. It's teeny tiny. There are very, very few things that exist in archives that you can find on the internet right now. Very, very small amount. And that's probably always going to be true, because the cost of doing that work is kind of onerous. But there are a couple things that you can know about the stuff that you are available to find online. So first of all, a collection might be digitized in its entirety, and you can see all the things that were in that collection originally. But quite often there are only a few things that have been digitized, sometimes because people have already asked for them and we've kind of added them into the description. So if you find just a small amount of the things that are digitized in the collection, make sure you treat them as just a small portion of the collection. If you see those digitized things, you haven't seen it all. If you find material that you can't place within a bigger collection, you're not done looking. You need to find that context, just like you would in person. You have to figure out, where does this stuff come from? Because if there is a memo in my papers, it's going to mean something different from if that same memo exists in Kristen's papers. And that's because every collection is made up of the life of that person's work. So what I'm working on and what that means to me is going to be different from what Kristen's working on and what that means to her. So you have to find out what collection it comes from. You have to figure out, what is the landscape that this exists in. The other thing is that you have to understand the context beyond that as well, and find out what things fall into your category that aren't digitized. That's a part of your research. Even if you can't see it now, even if you don't ever actually use it, you need to know what things you haven't seen. So we have, for example, the Tony Swanger papers dealing with like women's health, etc. Those are things you could see online right now. You could see the whole collection, which is great. But you also have to understand what things exist on that topic that you can't see right now. We've got several other collections that would fall into that category. You can see the finding aids online. Most repositories are going to let you see that level of information, so you can at least get a sense of what is out there generally, what kinds of things would be available to you. So put it in your research notes. You're going to need to know that in order to analyze the stuff that you can actually see online. There are a lot of reasons that a thing might have been digitized. And okay, so the things that have been digitized already are most likely done because people ask for them a lot. So somebody else has already worked on this material. It's worth noting that the stuff that's digitized is because it's popular. Other scholars have used it. So if you need to have kind of an original analysis, it's going to be really, really difficult to do that with just stuff that's already digitized and published online, which doesn't mean it's not valuable to you. It just means that that you might have to kind of map out the ways that you can take an original perspective on it. Kristen, you are making I
will add to that too, though, that another reason that things are digitized is because archivists flag them. I routinely flag things in the reading room that are in need of digitization because they are fragile, delicate, they are being used frequently, so and it's showing. So it's not just because someone's using them a lot and writing about things a lot. Sometimes it really is just because of the state of the records themselves. So that's also something to keep in mind.
Yeah. And Kristen, we were talking earlier about how some some secondary sources, you can kind of trace the footnotes to find some material there as well.
So I always recommend to students that they look at bibliographies to see what people have used when they're writing their books. What sources have they used? Especially if you're having trouble kind of narrowing down your topic, it's always helpful to see what other people looked at. And when you see what archives they looked at, it's especially helpful, especially when it's our material, because they tell you exactly what box and folder they looked at, for example. So you can come in and look at their footnotes. So when you can track through their bibliography, sometimes when they then cite those things in their book, they include a copy of it. So it's kind of a backdoor way to look at primary sources when they're citing a photograph, or they're using a letter, or some other piece of correspondence, for example, that you can see that actual document or photograph in the book, or journal article, or whatever, is the publication. That's another way to see a primary source in use.
It's always, I mean, always consider the context though. So that in that case, like you might be able to see this one thing, but think about the other things that you can't see. Especially if you Google, for example, and you do find something that looks useful to you, always look for, in archives we call it metadata, but it's the information about where that stuff came from. It could be that it is displayed. Hopefully it will be, and you found it in a repository that shows those things. But even if you're finding it through image search, look in the file info. See if you can figure out what collection did it come from, what repository did it come from, so you can find that context that you're going to need to understand it best. So just a quick summary of tips. Make sure that you know what you're looking at. That's really important. Figure out what collection it's from. What is the information to know about that organization or person that made that collection? Do you have all the information you need based on what you can see, or do you need to kind of look a little bit further? Keep in mind, you should be aware at least of the non-digitized collections that might be useful to you. Understand kind of, what percentage of the information on this topic can you see right now? Then you can understand like how much, kind of extra work you need to do, or how much authority you can say that your analysis carries at this point. And always remember that you can ask us. There is stuff that is digitized that you cannot find online. Sometimes that's because, for privacy reasons, it's normally on-site access only. That is true of some things. And some of it's just because we haven't published it online yet. And now that we're not in person, it's much more difficult to do. So we are really, really happy to talk to you all about your projects and give you whatever insight we might have, but ask.
And I think can I say just from the faculty perspective too, or from the researcher perspective, one thing to think about is when you're online, if you have a fully digitized collection, which is very rare, right? But say you have one, right? You've got one that's fully digitized, or maybe more than one. And so every document is online. But going through it online is very different than going through it in a file folder. You lose original order, you lose not just the context of the larger collection, but of the documents immediately surrounding it. Just knowing which folder it was in is not the same as flipping through 7 or 8 pages together to see what was going on. And you lose a little bit of that serendipity of running across a folder. You open a folder that has some name that you never would have thought to look at. And then you find, your item. You might lose that because the way we search for things online is so different. We do keyword searches. We don't sit there and click through every document in the way you might actually flip through every document in a folder. Mm-hmm. And so there's something about that tactile nature of things that is lost. Now, when you're dealing with a huge collection and you can run keyword searches, you might also turn up documents in folders you never would have looked at in the archive because you never even would have pulled that box. So there are benefits and drawbacks to both. But I think you need to be aware. I really want to emphasize what Meghan has been emphasizing about context. That it's much easier to lose that, I think, when you're looking online, and you're so trained to think that if it's online, then all of it's there. I think our minds just work in a different way when we're looking at digital collections. So you should remind yourself to ask the questions of those digital documents that you're trained to ask as you're going through them in a physical archive, but you don't necessarily think about them in the same way or think as critically about the digital collections because you added information literacy on the internet in all instances as we keep learning. So.
It takes some practice for sure.
Yeah.
And one little tip about whether or not you can see the whole folder. So some archives and some collections have digitized the whole folder. And you will know that you found that when you have like a massive PDF with a bunch of stuff that doesn't seem like it's related. That's because they've just scanned the whole folder. So you can kind of see the context. So look for that if it is available. Sometimes it is. The other thing about if you have a big chunk of stuff and you're keyword searching is this, might sound like common sense, but remind yourself, don't stop at one keyword search, right? So we had some students that wanted to do research about opioid addiction, and they were searching for just opioid and like having a hard time because you have to think about how this stuff was originally described by the people living this life. They weren't walking around saying opioid to each other. They might have been saying heroin. They might have been saying dope. They might have just been saying drugs. So be, as you would in person, creative about the searches you're doing and try to be as exhaustive you can about the possible terminologies that would have been used by the people at the time.
I think all of this sounds like something that would be a great class for, any faculty listening.
Which we're happy to discuss. Okay.